An elderly black woman, sitting quietly on a park bench. No crime, no noise, just presence. But within minutes, 8 officers, a police dog, and a wall of suspicion surrounded her. They didn't ask her name. They didn't need a reason. They just saw her skin and acted like that was threat enough. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. She was just a woman on a bench. That's how it started. That's how it always starts. The sun had barely pierced the veil of fog rolling over Willowbrook Park when Ruth Ellison arrived, same as she did every Friday. She moved slowly, age and arthritis setting the rhythm, but her movements were deliberate, her presence unmistakable. Wide-brimmed straw hat, burgundy cardigan buttoned against the chill, a leather-bound book of Langston Hughes poems resting quietly on her lap. To those who looked closely, there was dignity in her stillness. But most people didn't look closely. To the ones who called, she was a shape on a bench, unmoving, unknown, unbelonging. The call came in at 9:13 a.m. A concerned citizen reported an elderly black woman seated under the large cypress by the East Trail. She hasn't moved in over an hour, the voice said. Might be lost, or homeless, or something else. That something else hung in the air like the fog. Not said, just assumed. By 9:26, the sirens had arrived. 3 squad cars, 2 officers per vehicle. 8 boots on the ground for one woman with a tote bag full of Werthers and a dog-eared church bulletin. Officer Terrence Cole led the group, early 50s veteran walking, with the slow caution of someone who's seen too much and trusts too little. Behind him was Officer Brett Langley, fresh out of academy buzz cut sharp and posture stiffer than his starched collar. Officer Dana Morales came third, quiet, observant, holding the leash of Diesel, a muscled Dutch shepherd whose reputation in the department leaned closer to legend than protocol. Ruth didn't move when they approached. Not because she didn't see them. She had watched them from the moment they turned onto the gravel path. But because some lessons don't leave you, even after 78 years. The lesson of stillness. The lesson that sometimes not moving is the only safety you have left. Cole stepped forward, first voice low, rehearsed the tone that falls somewhere between command and concern. Ma'am, we got a call. Just want to make sure you're okay. Ruth looked up. Her eyes, framed by wrinkles and wisdom, were clear. I'm waiting on my grandson, she said. He gets out of school early on Fridays. We walk together. Langley shifted behind her, flanking. Do you have ID? She nodded, reached slowly into her bag. The movement was intentional. She had been taught, like so many black elders had taught themselves and their children, slow hands save lives. She handed over her wallet, worn from years of handling, and said nothing as Langley inspected it. Ruth Ellison, he read aloud. Retired. Teacher. 40 years, she replied softly. Mostly English and history. I still help out at the library downtown. Morales hadn't spoken, but Diesel had started to growl. A low, guttural sound. Not threatening yet, more confused, as if he was remembering something that didn't quite fit the narrative he'd been trained to obey. Langley looked to Cole. This could be fake. Fake, Morales said for the first time, her brow creasing. Cole ignored them both. "We've had some reports that you're making people uncomfortable, ma'am." There it was. That word. Uncomfortable. It was never about action. It was about presence. About the kind of presence that doesn't fit cleanly into someone else's vision of what should be. Ruth sat a little straighter. What did I do to make them uncomfortable? Langley didn't answer. Cole said, "People worry, ma'am. It's a public space. You've been here for a while." And the tree, she asked, "It's been here longer." No one laughed. Diesel's growl grew louder. Langley said, "We need to let the dog clear her." Morales hesitated. "Sir, she's not resisting. It's not about resistance. It's about safety." "Who's Morales?" asked. Langley stepped closer. "Let the dog go." Morales didn't move. Langley reached over and unhooked the leash himself, and Diesel surged forward. What happened next should have ended in chaos. Should have ended in a bite, a scream, a scuffle. That's what the training prepared for. That's what the phones now pointed in their direction were waiting for. But none of it came. Ruth didn't scream. She didn't move. She leaned forward just slightly and whispered one word: freedom. The dog froze mid-stride. Paws scuffed to a stop. Hackles fell. Muscles relaxed. Diesel stared at her, his ears flicking like he was trying to catch a familiar tune in a noisy room. Ruth opened her palm. Diesel inched forward, tail lowering his head, bowing. He whined soft, low longing. Then slowly, impossibly, he rested his snout in her lap. Langley cursed. Cole blinked. Morales whispered, "What in God's name?" Ruth stroked the dog's head like a child. "I called him Freedom," she said, "years ago, when he was rescued from a fighting ring and no one could get near him. I fostered him, read to him, taught him that the world didn't have to hurt. Before he was yours, he was mine." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. Full of memory, of shame, of realization. Ruth didn't gloat. She didn't stand. She didn't ask for an apology. She just kept petting the dog that had remembered her name when the world had nearly forgotten it. And around her, the story began to shift. Because she wasn't just a woman on a bench anymore. She was the bench. Rooted. Quiet. Impossible to move. And suddenly everybody saw her. The next morning, the bench beneath the cypress stood in its usual place, silent, unmoved, unaware that it had become the epicenter of something much larger than anyone could have expected. The sunlight broke through the trees as if nothing had happened. Ducks trailed ripples across the surface of the pond. Joggers passed with headphones in. Children chased shadows near the swing sets. To the park, everything was ordinary. But the silence had changed. It was no longer the stillness of peace. It was the stillness that follows a storm not yet named. Ruth Ellison stayed home that day, not out of fear, not out of shame, but because her body needed to breathe. There was a tension in her spine, an ache in her fingers, not from age, but from memory. From the way Officer Langley had looked at her not as a person, but as a puzzle that needed solving. From the way Diesel, the dog now known to her as Freedom, had remembered what the men around him had forgotten, that presence, stillness, and dignity are not threats. She had not slept well. Not because of nightmares, but because she kept hearing the word uncomfortable echoing in her thoughts. Uncomfortable. That was the charge against her, not trespassing, not loitering, not disorderly conduct, just existing in a way that made someone else unsure of themselves. Ruth thought back to other moments like this. Moments that didn't make the news, that didn't need sirens to feel dangerous. She remembered the first time she was called gal by a principal, despite having taught longer than he'd been alive. She remembered being asked to leave a clothing boutique in Savannah because we don't carry your size, though the real issue wasn't her size. She remembered being followed around grocery stores by employees pretending to reorganize shelves. And yet none of those moments prepared her for how cold it felt to be questioned on a bench she'd sat on every week for 12 years. At the local precinct, the mood was tense. Officer Morales didn't say much, but her silence was heavy with thought. She had reviewed her own body cam footage 3 times before turning it in. She had watched the dog's eyes, the change that came over him when Ruth said his name. And she had watched herself in that moment, gripping a leash not to protect the public, but to keep control over a situation that had never required control in the first place. Langley, on the other hand, seemed more rattled by the fact that the story didn't fit the training manual. She knew the dog's name, he muttered to a colleague. She trained him, fostered him. What are the odds? But the tone wasn't curious. It was defensive, as if the truth had threatened something inside him he wasn't ready to examine. Ruth wasn't thinking about Langley. She was thinking about her students. Former students who now taught or nursed or drove buses or wrote poetry in corners of the world she'd never see. She wondered if they ever thought of her, if they remembered how she never raised her voice in class, but always made sure every hand was called on, even the kids who barely spoke, especially them. One of those former students, now grown, happened to be at the park that morning. Thomas Raymond, 37, with 2 kids of his own, had seen the scene unfold the day before, but hadn't been close enough to intervene. He had stood frozen near the pond phone in hand, not filming, but paralyzed, watching something that stirred a hurt too old to name. Today he walked to the bench, sat for a moment, looked around, then reached into his bag and placed a single yellow daisy on the seat. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Word had started to spread, not through news stations, but in text threads and neighborhood groups. Was that Mrs. Ellison? People asked. The one who taught AP English. She's still around. She was always so still. Yes, still. And that stillness had always been misunderstood. In meetings, in classrooms, in grocery lines. People mistook her silence for submission, mistook her age for fragility, mistook her race for ignorance. But Ruth had never been fragile. She had been still, because stillness gave her room to see. Because when you've spent a life navigating spaces that weren't built for you, stillness becomes a strategy. A way of claiming space without apology. A way of protecting your soul from constant abrasion. Back in her kitchen, Ruth boiled water for tea. Her hands, though aged, moved with precision. She pulled a worn envelope from a drawer inside a collection of letters from students she had kept for decades. She read one from a girl named Sharonda who had written, "You taught me that not raising my voice doesn't mean I have nothing to say." Another from a boy named Jordan. "Thank you for seeing me when I was trying to disappear." That's what yesterday had stolen, however briefly, the assumption that people like Ruth Ellison didn't belong in spaces unless they were loud or smiling or useful. That they couldn't just sit, just breathe, just be. What Langley and the others didn't realize was that Ruth had been fighting this fight long before she sat on that bench. She had fought it in school board meetings, where she was the only black voice. She had fought it in lesson plans that dared include Zora Neale Hurston and James Baldwin, when others said, stick to the classics. She had fought it by staying put in a community that often forgot her until it needed a volunteer, a reading coach, a calming presence. Now the world had seen her stillness and called it suspicious. But in truth, that stillness had always been her power. She stirred her tea and stared out the window where the light touched the leaves like a benediction. Let them misunderstand, she thought. She knew who she was, and so did the dog. The bench beneath the cypress no longer sat unnoticed. It had become something more than wood and iron. It was now a place layered with unspoken meaning, a monument not yet carved, but felt in the air in the way people passed it slower, more watchful, more reverent. Ruth Ellison didn't return to the park immediately. Not out of bitterness. Ruth had long since stopped giving bitterness any room to grow, but because something had shifted. The world had said her name aloud, and that simple act had unsettled the quiet she'd built around herself. Being known again came with its own ache, a tenderness of being seen after decades of blending into the scenery. She wasn't invisible before, not truly, but the world had practiced looking past her for so long that when it finally paused, the weight of that gaze felt like both a gift and a wound. At her modest home, tucked between two overgrown magnolias and a sagging porch swing, Ruth brewed coffee in her old percolator. She moved slower than usual, not from pain, but from thought. The name she'd spent her life quietly carrying, Ruth Ellison, was now being spoken again. But this time, it wasn't just in the mouths of those who loved her. It was in conversations at bus stops, in murmurs at the local barbershop, in the whispered awe of strangers who'd only heard of what had happened from a video that never went viral, but still found its way into inboxes and church prayer groups. What did they see in that video? An old black woman who calmed a trained police dog with a whisper. Maybe. But if they looked closer, if they really looked, they saw a woman who had never once raised her voice in public, never once sought recognition, now forcing an entire system to remember who she was, not with force, but with memory. It wasn't just the dog who remembered her. Ruth had taught in this town for 40 years. Public school. Room 207. Taught students who barely had pencils, but left her classroom with stories in their bones. She had known the quiet kids, the angry ones, the ones who didn't know how to be seen without bracing for judgment. She had seen herself in them. And in all those years, she had never demanded to be remembered. But somehow they did. One by one, letters started arriving, slipped under her door, folded into the pages of library books she once donated, mailed from far-off states, some signed, some anonymous. Ms. Ellison, one read, "You told me I had a poet's voice when no one else cared if I even read aloud." Another, "You let me rewrite my paper 4 times, not because it wasn't good, but because you said I had something more to say. I've been writing ever since." And then there were visits. Rachel Daniels, 25, came by with a folder of old lesson plans Ruth had once given her after tutoring sessions at the community center. "You taught me to read through my stutter," she said, tears balancing behind her lashes. "You didn't wait for me to speak right. You waited for me to speak." Ruth didn't respond with a grand gesture. She just placed a hand on Rachel's and let silence carry the rest. And then came Officer Morales. She didn't wear her uniform that day. No badge, no weight of authority, just jeans and a t-shirt and a look on her face. Ruth had only ever seen on students who got caught cheating, but wanted to apologize without losing their pride. She brought with her a photo, an old one, printed from the station archives. It was of Diesel, years ago, fresh into training. His eyes hadn't hardened yet, his fur still soft from healing. "I didn't know who he was before you said his name," Morales said quietly. And I didn't know who you were either. That's my failure. Ruth studied her. Most failures aren't final, just unfinished. Morales sat on the porch step. I've been rewatching the footage over and over. I didn't see a threat, but I didn't stop it either. That's how systems survive, Ruth said. Not through monsters, through silence. They drank coffee together. Not as teacher and student, not as elder and officer. Just as two women, both wrestling with how the world teaches us to see and how long it takes to unlearn it. Later that week, the bench had flowers on it, a small stack of notes, a child's drawing of a woman and a dog. There was no official recognition, no press release, no Day of Ruth declared by City Council. But it was starting. Memory, after all, doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it comes quietly, like roots breaking pavement. A librarian reached out about hosting a community reading in her honor. A group of parents requested she come back to read to the third graders. A high school senior asked if he could interview her for his capstone on unsung community leaders. She said yes to none of it, not yet. Because this was the chapter she never thought she'd live to write. The one where her name wasn't just remembered, it was relearned, respoken, reclaimed by people who finally understood what it meant to have someone like Ruth Ellison sit quietly in their community for decades, giving and giving, never asking to be seen, only to be trusted. And maybe that's what a legacy is. Not the stories people tell about you when you're gone, but the ones they finally realize they lived because you were there all along. Understood. I will now write 4. The stories they never heard. Continuing the story of Ruth Ellison with emotional depth and fidelity to the narrative structure you've established. The park had begun to change not in appearance, but in attention. The cypress tree still cast the same long shadow over the bench. Each morning the ducks still circled the pond in quiet formation, and joggers still passed through half-present with their earbuds and heart monitors. But now, people noticed things they hadn't before. They noticed the bench. They noticed the name Ruth Ellison. And some of them, those who had once hurried past the still figure on that bench, began to wonder who she had always been. Ruth returned to the park quietly 1 week after the incident. She wore the same cardigan, brought the same dog-eared book of poems, and carried the same thermos of coffee sweetened the way her late husband used to prefer it. The bench was different now, not in structure, but in atmosphere. It had become a place of memory, of watching, of listening. A young man approached as she sat hands folded in her lap. He stood awkwardly shifting from foot to foot until Ruth looked up and smiled. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. "But, are you Mrs. Ellison?" She nodded. "Yes, baby. I think you taught my aunt. She always talked about how you used to tell stories before class started. She said those stories helped her feel like she mattered." Ruth didn't say anything at first, just gestured to the empty seat beside her. He sat, and they stayed that way for a while, silent, watching the ducks. After a few minutes, he said, "Would you tell me one of those stories?" And so she did. She told him about a boy named Isaiah, who used to sit in the back of her classroom hoodie up, always doodling in the margins of his math book. Teachers said he was a lost cause. Ruth gave him a journal instead. Today, he was a muralist whose work wrapped around entire buildings in Memphis. She told him about Denise, who stuttered so badly she wouldn't read aloud. Ruth never forced her. Instead, she let her recite Langston Hughes at lunch when no one else was around. Denise went on to become a speech therapist. She told him about the girls who carried shame in their silence, and the boys who were punished for their anger when all they wanted was to be heard. These weren't stories that made headlines. They were the kind of stories that lived in the corners of memory, quiet but weighty. They didn't involve protests or lawsuits or cameras, just transformation, slow, steady, unseen by most. The young man left with tears in his eyes, promising to bring his aunt next time. Ruth didn't wait for him to return. She just stayed there, eyes on the water, letting the memories settle like sediment. Later that week, Rachel Daniels returned. She carried a small recording device and a notepad thick with scribbles. She asked if Ruth would help her build something, a digital archive of untold stories. Not biographies, Rachel said. Legacies. The kind of stories no one asks for until it's too late. Ruth agreed under one condition. Tell them like they matter, not like they're favors, not like we're exceptions, just like we've been here the whole time. So they began. Day by day, they gathered names. Former students sent in letters. Nurses wrote in to say they'd learned patience from Ruth's calm. A social worker submitted a photo of her daughter's bookshelf, where a note card from Ruth still marked the definition of dignity. Parents remembered PTA meetings where Ruth spoke softly but firmly against book bans, curriculum cuts, and school board indifference. Even strangers wrote in. One man said he used to see her at the grocery store every Tuesday morning. She always bought 3 kinds of tea and never carried more than 1 bag, he wrote. I didn't know her name then, but I remember her now. Some stories came with names, others came anonymously, but all of them pointed back to a truth that echoed louder. Each day, Ruth Ellison had been doing sacred work in plain sight. The kind of work no title, no award, and no spotlight could ever fully capture. One afternoon, Officer Morales came to the park in plain clothes again. She sat next to Ruth and held out a flash drive. It's the footage, she said. Not just yours. All the body cam footage and the department's report. I don't know what you want to do with it, but I wanted you to have it. Ruth took it, not because she needed proof, but because sometimes holding the truth in your hand helps you remember that it happened, that it mattered. What are you going to do now? Morales asked. Ruth looked out over the pond. Same thing I've always done. Tell the stories they never asked to hear. She smiled not out of pride, but out of purpose, because for all the years people had passed her by, she had never stopped watching, never stopped gathering the details others missed, never stopped believing that quiet lives hold loud truths. And now, for the first time, the world had slowed down long enough to listen. That summer, the city experienced a change that didn't make headlines, but could be felt in the way people started to look at one another a little longer, with more curiosity, more patience. Willow Creek Park became a place not just for leisure, but for quiet reflection. Teachers brought their classes there during field trips and pointed to the bench beneath the cypress. Parents whispered the story into their children's ears, letting it settle like folklore truth wrapped in humility. One day, a teenager named Malik took the long route home after school and found himself standing near the bench. He didn't know Ruth personally, but he knew the story. His grandmother had cried the night she heard about it, repeating Ruth's name over and over like a hymn. Malik didn't sit right away. He stood in front of the bench, hat in hand, unsure if he had the right. But then he saw the plaque, and it didn't say anything about needing permission. So he sat, not to rest, but to listen, to the wind, to the birds, to the distant laugh of children, and the rustle of leaves overhead. to all the sounds that had gone unnoticed before Ruth taught the city how to hear again. And as he sat there, he thought about his own name, about how often it was mispronounced or shortened or dismissed. He thought about how Ruth had insisted on calling every student by their full name. He realized that mattered. That same week, a new flyer appeared on the community bulletin board, Echo Bench Story Circles, Fridays at 3 p.m. Come sit, come share, come remember. No sign up, no spotlight, just an invitation. At the first gathering, only 4 people came. One was Rachel. One was Ruth. The other 2 were strangers to each other, but they shared stories like they'd known each other all their lives. One woman spoke of her father, who worked as a janitor for 30 years and never missed a day. A man spoke of his mother, who raised 5 kids while studying for her GED in secret. They spoke softly, sometimes tearfully. Ruth nodded. She didn't interrupt. She never needed to. Each Friday after that, the circle grew. By midsummer, there were nearly 24 people at every session, young and old black and white newcomers, and longtime residents. They brought food instruments, old photos, favorite books. They brought pieces of themselves, not to impress, but to honor. The city at last began to catch up to what was happening. The Parks and Rec Department installed a small amphitheater not far from the bench. Nothing flashy, just a few curved rows of stone seats. The space was renamed the Listening Grove. A muralist painted a portrait of Ruth and Freedom across the back wall. Ruth seated Freedom alert at her side, both watching the scene unfold. Above them were the words, "Stillness is not absence. It is presence remembered." Ruth was asked to give a speech at the dedication. She declined. Instead, she handed Rachel a letter to read aloud. It said, "I never asked to be seen. I only asked to see." If you find yourself sitting on this bench one day, unsure of what to say, just look around. Someone else is watching, waiting, listening. Be the person who remembers the names, all of them, especially the ones others forget. That letter was framed and hung inside City Hall in a new wing dedicated to community justice. They called it the Ellison Room. But Ruth never visited. She wasn't interested in buildings. She was interested in people. She continued to show up every Friday. She didn't always speak. Sometimes she just sat, and when others came to sit beside her young men with unspoken burdens, mothers with stories stitched into their silence, elders who remembered too much, she listened. She always listened. Freedom became the park's unofficial guardian. Children ran to him first before approaching the bench. He'd grown older a little slower, but he never left Ruth's side. Not once. And then one evening in early fall, after the sun had dipped low and the park began to empty, Ruth leaned forward, patted her lap, and whispered, "It's time to go, boy." Freedom rose, as if he'd been waiting all day for those words. Together, they walked home slowly, the bench behind them, already holding space for the next story. That winter, the cypress tree stood tall through rain and wind unshaken. And though snow rarely fell in Willow Creek, frost curled along the bench like a veil. Still people came. Bundled in scarves holding hot drinks, they sat. They shared. They remembered. The story of Ruth Ellison never became a national headline, but that was never the goal. Her story lived in the shift of a culture, one that had long learned to dismiss what it couldn't categorize. She didn't just change policy. She changed perception. And she did it not by demanding to be heard, but by listening first. In a world that often measures value by volume, Ruth Ellison taught us the power of quiet. And so on Fridays, the bench is never empty. Because now, everyone understands it was never just a bench. It was always an invitation. Ruth Ellison was never meant to be a headline. She never chased attention or accolades. She sat, she taught, she listened. And in doing so, she changed lives quietly, profoundly, and without ever asking for recognition. But when one day in Willow Creek Park a leash was loosened, a dog lunged, and a whisper stopped the world, her story was finally forced into view. Not because she demanded it, but because the truth had waited long enough. Ruth's story is about the power of stillness in a world addicted to noise. It's about what happens when presence is mistaken for threat, when silence is read as defiance, and when a society forgets the value of those who built it, one child, one classroom, one kind word at a time. She wasn't just an elderly woman on a bench. She was a living archive of grace, dignity, and resilience. The impact of that day didn't end with an apology or policy reform. It echoed into classrooms, into community libraries, into family conversations. A scholarship was created. A park bench became sacred ground. A former police dog remembered who taught him love. And a city, perhaps for the first time, learned how to listen. But this story was never just about Ruth. It's about all the people like her elders, teachers, community workers who labor in the background of our lives, often invisible, until something forces us to look closer. It's about the danger of assumptions, the harm of silent biases, and the healing that becomes possible when we pause long enough to see someone fully. So what do we take from Ruth Ellison's journey? We take the reminder that dignity does not come from titles or volume. It comes from how we live, how we treat others, and how we choose to remember those who shaped us. We carry forward her wisdom by choosing to sit beside someone who's alone, by asking the names we've never taken time to learn, by creating space for voices that don't rise above the crowd but still carry weight. In today's world, one of polarization, hurry, and fear, we need stories like Ruth's more than ever. They ground us, they challenge us, and they remind us that the greatest change often begins with the smallest act: listening. If this story touched you, moved you, or made you see something in a new light, we invite you to join us on this journey. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate unseen heroes, challenge injustice, and inspire hope. Every comment, every subscriber helps us continue sharing the voices that matter, not just the loudest ones, but the ones we can't afford to ignore any longer. Because sometimes the quietest presence in the room is the one holding the deepest truth. And those stories deserve to be heard.